What's going on, everybody? Today I've got one of my projects that I've really been looking forward to getting back to, and that is the TRX4 Sport Mud Truck conversion. In a previous video, I installed the Traxxas lift kit as well as the J-Concepts Fling King tires and the wheels that they sell as well. And I'll link to those in the description below, as well as that last video that I did where I installed these. But this time what we're going to do is we're going to be replacing the electronics in this build. What we've got here in front of me is the Castle Sidewinder 4 and the 3800 kV 4-pole 1410 motor. Now this is the short course edition. It's got the 5mm pinion shaft. I've also picked up a new pinion gear for it as well. But along with that motor and ESC, I'm also going to be replacing the servo. I picked up one of the EcoPower 120T servos from Amain Hobbies. This is a metal gear waterproof servo with a lot more power than the stock one. This should give us a much more reliable driving experience. And for that servo, while we're at it, I'm also going to be installing one of the Vanquish 25-2 servo horns. So our task for today is to remove the stock electronics and install these new ones. During the installation process of this, I'm also going to take out that stock Traxxas receiver and put one of my own Futaba receivers in there, just so that we complete the removal of the Traxxas electronics for an upgraded set. So we're going to remove the body and get into this installation. To start the process, we're going to be removing the Traxxas XL5 ESC and that stock motor. Then we're also going to open the waterproof receiver case to remove that stock receiver. And lastly, we're also going to need to remove that stock front servo. Removing the two screws easily allows us to pull that XL5 ESC from being attached to the sliders, but we also need to unplug it from the receiver box to be able to completely remove it from the vehicle. To remove the receiver, we also need to remove the antenna, pull off the antenna tube cap, and loosen the set screw next to the antenna tube itself. The stock ESC is also zip tied underneath of the battery case. So to make this simple, I'm just going to remove the whole battery tray itself. So now we can throw this whole thing to the side. Removing the motor from the vehicle is probably the easiest part. Removing the 3 screws that hold the gear cover in place allow us to pull the entire motor plate and motor out of the vehicle. Next, we need to remove the 4 screws that hold the servo in place. You will need to remove the panhard screw to be able to get the servo out. Do this first so that you can more easily get to the 4 servo screws that hold the stock servo into place. These are somewhat blocked by the axle, so if you don't have a long set of tools, it may be hard. You may have to actually remove some of the other pieces to be able to get to this easily. Once you've removed all 4 screws, you can remove that stock servo. And now at this point, we can kind of start to reverse the process. I'm going to throw in the EcoPower 120T first. For that new EcoPower servo, I'm going to be using the Vanquish Products 25-tooth 20mm servo horn. This is part number VPS02412. Now, before installing the servo horn though, we need to make sure that we find center. You can do this by plugging it into your receiver, turning it on, and making sure that your receiver is centered, but you can also use a servo tester to do this same thing. So with the tester, we can put it to the neutral position, and that will center our servo. At that point, we can disconnect it and then set our servo horn up in the neutral position as well. To ensure that we set the servo at as close to straight on the wheels as possible, I'm going to make sure that all my suspension links are reinstalled, and I've actually installed the servo horn onto the drag link first, so that then I can make sure that the wheels are pointed forward and then install it. Because while the wheels may be pointed forward, the servo horn may not be completely straight, just depending on the slight differences in lengths between servo horns. So now with the new EcoPower servo installed with the Vanquish servo horn in place, I have routed the wire to the receiver box where I have put my new Futaba 2106 GF. And this one doesn't use an external longer antenna. It's got a very short one, but they work really well, and this just makes it a little bit cleaner. So at this point, we're going to grab the old motor, which still has the motor plate attached. We need to remove the motor plate from it and transfer it over to our new Castle motor. Now again, this is the 1410 3800 kV Castle motor. I think it's also important to note that I would normally not run a sensorless system in a crawler or trail rig, but this is being purpose built as a mud truck, and I'm not super worried about that low speed, super refined control. So that's why I'm running a sensorless system. So now we're going to remove the 2 motor screws that hold the motor onto the motor plate, as well as the set screw that holds the pinion onto the motor plate. So now with the motor plate and our motor here, we need to attach the motor onto the motor plate, but the Traxxas TRX4 uses preset gear mesh options, so we need to make sure that we're setting it to the right one. The TRX4 Sport comes with the 39 tooth spur gear, and I'm going to be using this 5mm bore 32 pitch 16 tooth pinion. So looking in the manual at their gear chart, that shows me that I need to use spot B on the motor plate. When attaching the motor to the motor plate, make sure and note where you're putting the motor wires. I'm putting them towards the top just to make sure that I can get them routed properly and they're not going to be in the way of any of the other driveline components. So now that we have the motor attached to the motor plate, I need to set the pinion position on this, but I need to make sure that it's going to be lining up with the spur gear properly. So I'm going to slide the pinion into place, then I'm going to mock this up in the chassis to make sure that I slot the inward and outward position of the pinion in the correct place. Before tightening the pinion in place, I am going to make sure and put a little bit of Loctite on the set screw first. And now since everything's tightened into place, we can place the whole assembly back and replace the 3 screws on the gear cover holding this into position. So now we have the motor resting in its final position inside the chassis. Now it's time to place the Sidewinder 4 into the chassis. For this one, we're just going to use some double-sided tape on the bottom of the actual Sidewinder 4, and we're going to double stick it into roughly the position that the stock ESC sat. Before we do that though, I'm going to double check that I've got plenty of length on my receiver wire as well. The Sidewinder 4 also has an externally powered fan that we need to run to the receiver for power. So with those wires kind of roughly routed, I'm going to replace the zip tie that was attached to the actual transmission housing just to hold those in place. I want to make sure and kind of route the wires where I want with the amount of slack that I want, and then I want to pull all of the extra slack into the receiver box just to make sure that my wiring looks as clean as possible from the outside. So now with everything pretty much set where I think it's going to be, I'm going to double stick tape that ESC in place. And now the final thing we're going to do is actually solder my battery connectors. I'm going to be using XT60 battery connectors. That's my preferred battery connector of choice now. I've got my 2 pieces of pre-cut heat shrink. I'm going to slide those over the 2 power wires first. I've got my XT60 connector in my Mr. Jig soldering jig here. I'm going to pre-tin both the positive and negative positions of this connector. With those positions pre-tinned and the leads of our Sidewinder 4 tinned, I can now heat up both sides and get them attached. With both wires soldered now, we can move our heat shrink into position. We're going to reinstall the battery tray now. Now before we actually put away the soldering iron, there's one other thing that I want to do, and that's remove this power wire. I don't ever really run power wires on my electronics, so what we're going to do is I'm going to take and just cut this off. Then we're going to strip back a length of these wires. Then we're just going to twist them together and add a little bit of solder to make sure that they can never lose connection. These wires aren't going to short out on anything. They're just simply to close a circuit. So there isn't really anything you need to do to protect it. I'm just going to simply zip tie them to the receiver wire and the fan power wire that go in towards the center of the vehicle. And that's just to keep it out of the way. Now we've got the 3 motor leads that came off the motor that we need to install into the 3 bullet plug. Since this is a sensorless motor, it does not matter what position you put these 3 wires. And if the direction is incorrect when you start it, you can simply switch any 2 positions of the wires to reverse the motor rotation. Now that those are installed, I didn't shorten this length of wires. In the interest of simplicity, I'm just leaving them as is. The only thing that I am going to do is put a little bit of a loop in them and then run them through the cable routing clip on the TRX4 Sport chassis. Then I'm going to take and install my Hobby Star 5200 milliamp 3S battery into the chassis so that I can bind my receiver and double check that everything's functioning properly. So now we've powered everything up. I've checked that the steering is in the center location and that our motor rotation is going in the correct direction. So all we have to do now is finalize putting the receiver cover on, and we can just give this thing a quick little test drive. So after a little bit of testing, I'd say that was a successful install and pretty much right in line with what I was looking for. It's able to pull the tires even on pavement with these knobby tires. You know, these tires probably not the most grippy on this surface, but in the dirt, in the mud, I think that they're going to do really well. The top speed's right in line with what I was looking for. I'm looking to really be able to kind of fling the mud with the torque rather than really just skate on top of it, but hopefully we can do a little bit of both. So now that we've got this rig ready to finally hit the mud, I just need to come up with the location and the mud hole that we're actually going to hit. So hopefully I can get that sorted soon and we'll see this thing in action here before too long. I'll put links to everything that I've got in this build in the description below in case you have any questions, or you can check out the last video for the instructions on installing this actual lift kit, wheels, and tires. So with that, guys, thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're not already, hit that notification bell if you want to make sure that you get notified as soon as this thing does hit the mud. But thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you on the next one.